The Italian Renaissance was a period of European history that began in the 14th century and lasted until the 17th century, marking the transition from the medieval period to modernity. The French word Renaissance means rebirth and defines the period as one of the cultural revival and renewed interest in classical antiquity after centuries labeled the Dark Ages by Renaissance humanists, who were inspired by the human arts, therefore their name humanists, and these are philosophy, medicine, literature, and architecture. The European Renaissance began in Tuscany and centered in the city of Florence. Florence, one of the several city-states of the peninsula, rose to economic prominence by providing credit for European monarchs and laying down the groundwork for capitalism and banking. The Renaissance later spread to Venice, heart of the Mediterranean Empire, and in control of the trade routes with the East since the participation in the Crusades and the voyages of Marco Polo, where the remains of ancient Greek culture were brought together and provided humanist scholars with the new texts. Finally, the Renaissance has a significant effect on the Papal States and Rome, largely rebuilt by humanist and Renaissance popes such as Alexander VI and Julius II, who were frequently involved in Italian politics and arbitrating disputes between competing colonial powers and in opposing the Reformation. Some view the Renaissance as a breakaway from religious dominance of humanity. While it did distance itself from religious influence, it did not completely drop religion either. In fact, many great Renaissance paintings and sculptures are church works. Therefore, most of the paintings that the Renaissance period provided were commissioned by or for the Catholic Church, thus the Christian theme. Indeed, the Christian influences seem intertwined with the Renaissance almost as much as science and progress have been entwined in it. Christian work, painted by various Renaissance men, are plenty. However, they involve the idealized human figure of the Greeks and Romans and use allegoric as well as mythological figures to portray Christian deities. This fusion of the Renaissance culture with religious stories forms the backbone of Renaissance culture. Italian Renaissance painting can be divided into four periods: the Proto-Renaissance, the Early Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and Mannerism. These dates are approximations rather than specific points, because the lives of individuals, artists, and their personal styles overlap their different periods. First, we have the Proto-Renaissance, which started in the 14th century until the 15th century. The Last Judgment frequently serves as a recurring theme in Christian paintings and Italian Proto-Renaissance. The Black Death of 1348 caused its survivors to focus on the need to approach death in a state of penitence and absolution. The inevitability of death, the rewards for the penitent, and the penalties of sin were emphasized in a number of frescoes, remarkable for their grim depictions of suffering and the surreal images of the torments of hell. One of the most popular artists of this period was Giotto, which was an Italian painter and architect from Florence during the late Middle Ages. He worked during the Gothic Proto-Renaissance period. Some of his great Christian paintings are the Great Mosaic of Christ walking on the water over the entrance of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. We also have Lamentation, as well as the Crucifixion of Rimini. The early Renaissance, which lasted from the 15th century until 1475. Patrons were popular at this time. These were wealthy people who sponsored artists to finish their work. Patrons of these artists were most often monastic establishments or wealthy families endowing a church. Because the paintings often had devotional purpose, the clients tended to be conservative. Some of the most popular Italian early Renaissance artists are Masaccio. He was a Florentine artist who is regarded as the first great Italian painter of the Quattrocento period of the Italian Renaissance. According to Vasari, a great philosopher of the time, Masaccio was the best painter of his generation because of his skill at imitating nature by creating lifelike figures and movements as well as convincing sense of three-dimensional figures. Masaccio died at 26 and little is known about the exact circumstances of his death. Despite his brief career, he had a profound influence on other artists. He was one of the first to use linear perspective in his painting, employing techniques such as vanishing point in art for the first time. He moved away from the international Gothic style and elaborate ornamentation of artists like Gentile da Fabriano to a more naturalistic mode that employed perspective and chiaroscuro for greater realism. Some of his most famous work are Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, The Expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. Another great artist from this period was Fra Angelico. He was an early Italian Renaissance painter, described by Vasari in his Lives of the Artists as having a rare and perfect talent. He was highly attached to the Catholic Church as he was summoned to work for the Pope and paint the frescoes of the Holy Sacrament at St. Peter's. His work is highly influenced by Christian redemption and adoration. Then we have the High Renaissance, from 1475 to approximately 1525, considered to have started in the late 1400s until the 1527 with the sack of Rome by the troops of Charles V. In Florence, in the later 15th century, most works of art, even those that were done as decoration for churches, were generally commissioned and paid for by private patrons. Much of the patronage came from the Medici family, or those who were closely associated with or related to them, such as the Sassetti, the Rucellai, and the Tornabuoni. However, in the medieval period, everything related to the classical period was perceived as associated with paganism. In the Renaissance, it came increasingly to be associated with enlightenment. The figures of classical mythology began to take on a new symbolic role in Christian art, and in particular, the goddess Venus took on a new discretion. Born fully formed by a sort of miracle, she was a new Eve, symbol of innocent love, or even, by extension, a symbol of the Virgin Mary herself. We see Venus in both these roles in two of the tempera paintings by Botticelli, The Primavera and The Birth of Venus. Many historians and scholars regard Leonardo as a prime example of the universal genius, or Renaissance man, and he's widely considered one of the most diversely talented individuals ever to have lived. Leonardo's studies of light, anatomy, landscape, and human expression greatly influenced his art. Some of his work includes The Last Supper, Annunciation. Michelangelo was an Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet of the High Renaissance, born in the Republic of Florence. He has been described as one of the greatest artists of all time. He is considered a contender for the title of the greatest Renaissance man, along with his rival, the fellow Florentine incline of the Medici, Leonardo da Vinci. His work includes The Creation of Adam and the Ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The Mannerist era, also known as late Renaissance, is a style in European art that emerged in the later years of the Italian High Renaissance, around 1520, and lasted until about the end of the 16th century in Italy, when the Baroque style began to replace it. Mannerism encompasses a variety of approaches influenced by and reacting to the harmonious ideas associated with artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and early Michelangelo. Where High Renaissance art emphasizes proportion, balance, and ideal beauty, Mannerism, however, exaggerates such qualities, often resulting in compositions that are symmetrical or unnaturally elegant. This style is notable for its intellectual sophistication as well as its artificial qualities. It favors compositional tension and instability rather than the balance and clarity of early Renaissance painting. Tintoretto's The Last Supper is a clear example. It highlights the urgency of the Catholic mission to encourage believers to remain in the Church rather than convert into Protestantism. Pablo Veronese's Christ in the House of Levi combines the strict rhythm of the classical architecture with the chaos of activity common in the later Renaissance art. Religion here was not a crucial theme anymore, as more and more artists were exploring into other techniques and themes such as exploration and technology. Furthermore, with the church being less and less powerful, it led to a new era,